Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Stilicho, the half-barbarian savior of Rome by History Dose. Now I think Stilicho is a real interesting character who lived during a very interesting and chaotic period of Roman history, and I'm glad we're getting a chance to sort of take a look at that era. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this episode, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to regular exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
There's an eerie silence in the thin mountain air. The Roman troops expected an ambush by now. Emperor Theodosius marches with 50,000 men through the Julian Alps, one late summer day in the year 394. He knows waiting up ahead is civil war. 2 years prior, the emperor of the western half of the empire, Valentinian II, attempted to remove his domineering general Arbogast from power. Arbogast refused and tore the order to pieces in front of him. Soon after, Valentinian was found hanging in his own residence. Arbogast claimed the emperor had killed himself, but others suspected murder.
And when I say this is an interesting and chaotic period in Roman history, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We're looking at an era where the power of emperors is really declining, and we see a bunch of these powerful generals like Arbogast, Stilicho, Ricimer. These are some of the most famous examples. Some are liked more than others. A lot of them are these sort of Romanized barbarians, aka, people with Germanic or quote-unquote barbarian backgrounds, what the Romans would have seen as barbarian, but who've been brought up in a Roman manner. But at this point, we're dealing with Theodosius I, the last emperor of a unified Rome. A pretty big deal, and this is how Stilicho sort of works his way up, so a real interesting period of time.
Regardless, the death of Valentinian meant that the Eastern Emperor Theodosius now became the rightful emperor of a reunited Roman Empire. But Arbogast objected and installed his own puppet Western Emperor, Eugenius. And so it is that Theodosius finds himself marching to Italy to reclaim the empire.
And that's what we have with this time period. We've got Eastern emperors, Western emperors, powerful generals both in the East and the West, but it seems like, especially in the West, these powerful generals would really overtake their emperors. Their emperors would become puppets. And we have a lot of infighting between East and West, conflict, warfare, political disagreements. And so, like I said, Theodosius, the last emperor of a unified Rome, you can see how divided the Roman Empire is becoming.
His trusted general Stilicho by his side. Stilicho's father hails from the tribal Vandal people. The Vandals, like other peoples outside of the empire, fall under the label barbarian.
Right.
While Roman aristocrats likely resent the fact that Stilicho is half-barbarian, to Theodosius, it makes no difference. The audacious Stilicho has risen through the ranks and married Theodosius's adopted daughter, Serena.
Yeah, so we've actually started the story of Stilicho fairly, not late, but pretty deep into his career. He's already risen up quite high. He's become intertwined with the family of the emperor. You can see how powerful Stilicho already is. And this is what I'm talking about when I say these Romanized barbarian generals. Stilicho had this barbarian background, and to the Romans, a lot of them didn't like that. A lot of these Romans had some pretty serious xenophobia, and so they would be very suspicious of someone like Stilicho. But in terms of culture, how he's been raised, his career, well, he's as Roman as the rest of them, and he's a pretty talented general, and clearly someone like Theodosius doesn't mind Stilicho's barbarian background. He's willing to give him this sort of responsibility and even bring the man into his own family. That's a show of trust if I've ever seen one.
He now leads the emperor's elite bodyguard unit through the Alps. This Eastern Roman army is also joined by nearly 20,000 foederati, or barbarians allied with the Roman Empire, including the cunning Goth leader Alaric, who has begrudgingly negotiated to serve in the Roman army after Stilicho crushed his attempts at invading the empire.
Yes, so we have the foederati. Now, at times they will be loyal troops to the Empire, at times they will cause a big problem, and I'm sure you can imagine why. It's these, and when I say barbarian, once again, we're using the sort of Roman definition of barbarian. There are these sort of barbarian auxiliary troops who, like I said, sometimes are loyal, but other times are not. And we talk about these Romanized barbarian generals. Sort of the counterpart on the other side are men like Alaric. Now, they are straight-up barbarians. Alaric is leader of the Visigoths, but at times he works with the Romans. So sort of interesting, someone with a barbarian background, but who hasn't been Romanized in the same way someone like Stilicho has been. Alaric will be a very powerful leader in this time period, and he'll be an important character in this story and in Roman history of this era.
As the armies descend from the mountain, Arbogast's massive western army comes into view, positioned all throughout the valley. Theodosius orders a head-on attack by the Foederati, but the Western Army massacres 10,000 of them, and Arbogast celebrates victory that night. The next morning, Stilicho and Theodosius lead a counterattack. A sudden mountain wind whips dust into their enemies' eyes, rendering their archers useless. They splinter Arbogast's front line and capture the enemy camp. Eugenius is executed, and Arbogast escapes alone into the mountains. He wanders for days before finally taking his own life.
Yep.
Under Theodosius, the empire is united once again. His two young sons are to one day be co-emperors.
I wonder who those two young sons would be. They're the son of this great unifier. Surely they'll be great emperors too. Is that how it works?
Honorius over the west and Arcadius the east.
Ooh, yeah, just about the opposite of what I just said. Neither are good, but Honorius in particular, really not good.
At the moment, neither are ready to rule. So when Theodosius falls,
I don't think Honorius will ever be ready to rule.
gravely ill that winter, he entrusts Stilicho to be the political guardian of Honorius, should the illness take his life. And Theodosius does indeed die that January. For all intents and purposes, Stilicho immediately becomes the ruler of the West. At least.
In this, I'm talking about how we have these powerful Roman generals. At times, these generals would be more powerful than their emperors. We have a series of puppet emperors, especially in the West. Now, this happens for a couple of reasons. First off, with such a militarized state of affairs, it makes sense that military leaders would gain a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. But when you have someone like Stilicho, who has been granted a lot of that power by the emperor himself, who has been brought into the emperor's family, sure, Stilicho has that military authority, but now his authority extends beyond that. Political authority, familial authority. So you can sort of see how through these webs of power, a lot of these guys become powerful. And so now Stilicho is watching over the early reign of Honorius, and especially if your emperor is a child or a young adult, that gives you an opportunity to build your own base of power.
At least until the 10-year-old Honorius can rule himself. With the 18-year-old Arcadius ruling in the east, the empire is again divided between east and west. Except Stilicho
permanently this time.
claims that on his deathbed, Theodosius privately called to him and granted him guardianship over Arcadius too, thus making him the de facto ruler of both the west and east. Whether or not Stilicho is telling the truth is irrelevant. The weak-willed Arcadius already rules under the thumb of Stilicho's rival, a cutthroat eastern general named Rufinus. Rufinus convinces the young emperor to reject Stilicho's claim of guardianship. For Stilicho, this seems like an issue for another day. He's now the ruler of the West and is struggling.
And it's an issue that will never be solved. At this point, the Roman Empire doesn't have too much longer to go. What I mean by that is the Western Roman Empire. Of course, the East will survive, but that's the very point. Rome doesn't have much longer. It will remain permanently divided until the West falls, and then only the East will remain.
To sustain the massive combined forces of Theodosius's eastern army and the western army he's just inherited. He dismisses Alaric and the Goths without fanfare or reward. Alaric won't have it.
Nope.
He and his
Alaric ain't happy.
troops ravaged the Roman countryside all the way to the gates of the eastern Roman capital, Constantinople. There he demands a high office in the Roman army. Rufinus pays him off and gives him permission to invade the Balkans and Greece instead. As Alaric begins to ravage cities, Stilicho grows eager to punish the traitorous Goth king.
And like I said, this was Roman policy of this period. You have these Romanized barbarian generals like Stilicho in service to the Roman state. And then you have these barbarian leaders, whether they be Vandals or Goths or what have you, who have this interesting relationship with the Roman Empire. At times they serve the empire, at times they go against it, sometimes they betray it, sometimes they side with it. I mean, it's a self-serving relationship. Of course, they're looking out for their own interests, but you end up in situations like this where the Eastern Emperor, or at least the general in control at the time, doesn't have the resources to deal with someone like Alaric, and so he just says, you know what, I give you permission to go raid here. I'll pay you off, go do your thing, so we don't have to worry about you anymore. At an earlier date, this would have been absolutely unthinkable. I mean, where is the territorial integrity of the Roman Empire? It can't control its own borders? No, it absolutely cannot at this point.
He musters his troops and crosses into the east. There he tracks Alaric deep into the Balkans and cuts him off. Victory is at hand, but at the last moment, an order arrives from the Eastern Emperor Arcadius. Stilicho is to return the eastern half of his army back to Constantinople. Rufinus is almost certainly behind this. After all, a glorious victory for Stilicho would have threatened Rufinus's hold on Arcadius. With his now depleted army, Stilicho makes the journey back to Italy, and Alaric escapes free. The Eastern army returns to Constantinople, greeted with fanfare by Rufinus and Arcadius. Then, as the leaders make their speeches, the troops rush the emperor's entourage and hack Rufinus to death.
Damn.
Stilicho may have organized this assassination, but others believe it was a eunuch in the imperial court named Eutropius. After arranging to have his political enemies exiled, Eutropius quickly becomes Arcadius's new puppet master.
And, interestingly enough, the East and the West are similar in many ways, but there are some differences, and I feel like one of the differences is that the East has this much more developed court culture than the West, and we see this throughout the history of the succeeding Byzantine Empire. There's this culture of political intrigue and eunuchs and court politics, and the West certainly has that too, but to me it always seemed more prevalent in the East. You see eunuchs and advisors gaining a lot of power in the East over Eastern emperors, whereas when we turn to the West, there certainly are powerful advisors, I'm not going to deny that, but a lot of those positions are filled with military men, generals, more so than in the East. I feel like, we have this spectrum, and the East is sort of more in the middle. You got your powerful military men, your powerful advisors, whereas the West is slanted far more towards the military side of things.
Stilicho still dreams of a united Roman Empire, and Eutropius stands in the way of that, but barbarian invasions along the Rhine River beckon him northward. Then, Alaric returns.
Uh-oh.
He and his Goths have invaded Greece, raided almost every major city, and sold thousands of people into slavery. So in 397, Stilicho hunts Alaric again. His fleet sails to Corinth, but the rescue mission is too late. Goods have been stolen, people slaughtered, and buildings burned.
And you can see what I mean when I say that Rome has no territorial integrity at this point. It really cannot defend its own territory, its own cities, its own people. And so, whatever grand plans Stilicho has, he's not going to get an opportunity to implement them because he has to deal with putting out every single fire that pops up, both metaphorically and literally. Every other day he has another massive issue to deal with. Barbarians have crossed the Rhine here, Alaric is raiding up and down the coast, we've got breakaway provinces, so many massive issues. You've got no time to implement any sort of overarching policy or trying to unify the empire. That is beyond your means. You just got to try and keep this thing together.
Stilicho knows the Goths are still close. He charges at the Gothic army, forcing them to retreat until finally he ensnares them atop a mountain. The battle is over. He needs only to wait until his enemies surrender or starve. News of the battle reaches Constantinople. Like Rufinus before him, Eutropius fears Stilicho becoming a hero in the east. He has Arcadius demand Stilicho leave Greece at once, but Stilicho purposely delays this time. He plans to leave only after he crushes Alaric. Eutropius won't allow it. He declares Stilicho a public enemy in the Eastern Roman Empire, making him an outlaw in the very cities he's trying to save. Eutropius then confiscates all of the goods and land Stilicho holds in the east.
Wow. And, I mean, this is just another example of how divided the Roman Empire is. And you can see that in both Stilicho's actions. He's trying to assert himself, he's trying to tackle the issue of Alaric, whereas the Eastern Emperor is sort of trying to placate Alaric, and then Stilicho basically has to deny the territorial integrity of the East to go do that, and now they brand him a public enemy. I mean, this is no united Roman Empire, and even though we just had Theodosius, right, the last emperor of a unified Rome, that is true, but let's be honest, at this point, Rome had gotten very used to being separated. The East and the West, not to mention all the breakaway provinces and barbarian states that had been popping up. So even though we had just had a quote-unquote unified empire, it really wasn't that unified, and we can see how divided sort of deep to the core Rome is at this point.
Somewhere in this chaos, Alaric bribes his way past some of Stilicho's troops, and the Goths escape down the mountain. Stilicho returns to the west, humiliated. Eutropius has taken his land, his possessions, and his right to rule in the east, and he isn't done twisting the knife. Eutropius offers Alaric a place in the Eastern Roman army as the chief general of all troops in Illyricum, the region directly bordering Italy. Alaric accepts and receives a massive salary and the resources of the Roman war machine.
And so you can imagine, if some Romans felt offended by Stilicho being given an important position, sure, a barbarian, but a very Romanized barbarian who had risen through the ranks under Theodosius, you can only imagine how some people must have felt about someone like Alaric being given these kind of positions. I mean, I'm sure he was very familiar with Rome. He was a very skilled and talented guy, but he was really not Romanized, not like Stilicho was. And so you can imagine how upset many of these fancy, I guess in this case, Constantinople Romans might have been.
With the world turning against him, Stilicho learns that Gildo, the leader of the western province of Africa, has decided to defect to the Eastern Empire. Africa is Rome's vital source of food. Without it, the city will starve. Eutropius, of course, supports Gildo in his decision to rebel against the West. Stilicho acts with violent haste. He sends Gildo's rival brother, Mascezel, to squash the rebellion. Gildo is captured, thrown in a dungeon, and executed. By now, Stilicho is no stranger to the betrayals, corruption, and assassinations underlying imperial politics. In fact, it's an art form he's mastered. When Mascezel triumphantly returns to Italy and begins to ally himself with Stilicho's political rivals, he has him thrown off a bridge and drowned.
Jesus.
Threats to power cannot be tolerated.
I mean, really, if you're serving in a position of power at this point, it really is a day-to-day struggle for survival. Any day, you wake up in the morning, step out of your home, head to the office, head to the palace, you could be executed. It really is that simple. It is extremely dangerous to be dealing with all of these power games and political disagreements at this time in Roman history.
That includes Eutropius, whose own popularity is hampered by his appointment of Alaric to a generalship and the fact that he is a eunuch, a castrated man.
Right.
Stilicho has no qualms about indulging in a bit of revenge here. He gives the Western court poet Claudian permission to publicly slander Eutropius. Claudian enthusiastically obliges. In 399, at the pleading of his wife...
And by the way, we get a lot of this story about Stilicho from Claudian, and this is one of the issues we run into when we look at Roman history, is that a lot of it is extremely biased. I mean, they just gave us a fantastic example there. Sometimes it can be that up front, sometimes maybe a little more subtle, but this is honestly, one of the biggest issues we have when looking at these sources, is that the men who were writing these things, well, their patron was one general or another, one politician, and of course they would write in favor of whoever was funding their research, and they would write disparagingly of anyone who opposed their patron. So, sort of a big issue when we're looking at our sources.
Arcadius exiles Eutropius. At a later date, Eutropius is recalled, tried for treason, and executed. As fortune would have it, Stilicho is enjoying new heights in power and popularity, and he receives a correspondence from his remaining nemesis. A humbled Alaric fears a rise in anti-barbarian sentiment in the east, and asks Stilicho for a position in his western army. Stilicho turns him down.
It is interesting that he went to Stilicho, because these two are rivals. You might think that's a little odd, but... and this is something that you might have sort of imagined, but that I haven't explicitly talked about, with this sort of barbarian background. You know, we've already covered how Stilicho is very Romanized, and I would imagine he saw himself as Roman in basically every way, versus someone like Alaric, who very much was not Romanized. Now, there is that difference, but being a barbarian, whether you sort of recognize it or not, was something that other people recognized. Stilicho might have seen himself as Roman, but a lot of those elite Romans did not view him that way. And a lot of the barbarians would have also viewed him with some sort of kinship. Alaric might have viewed Stilicho with some degree of kinship because of his barbarian background. A lot of the men serving under Stilicho, a lot of the barbarians or those with barbarian backgrounds might have felt some sort of loyalty to Stilicho because of his background. And this will come into play later, actually at the end of Stilicho's story, but that's something to keep in mind.
In the fall of 401, Stilicho races his troops across the Alps to drive off an invasion of Vandals and Alans, but he leaves Italy vulnerable, and Alaric takes notice.
Yes,
the
he
Goths
does.
charge into Italy, ransacking cities and ravaging countrysides.
And oh, how far Rome has fallen. The once sort of impregnable Italian peninsula, the heartland of the Roman Empire, a region that a couple hundred years ago you never could have imagined being attacked like this, is now, it might as well be the frontiers of the empire. It's just as susceptible to attack as really any of the other provinces are. It really shows you that decline in Roman power and authority.
Stilicho is stuck. It's now the dead of winter, and snow blocks the mountain passes back over the Alps. In the coming months, Alaric advances on his prize, the city of Milan, where the Western Emperor Honorius resides. Honorius flees from the gates as they approach, abandoning his city, but Alaric sees his feeble escape convoy and cuts it off. Honorius is forced to take refuge in the nearby city of Asta. Its defenses won't hold long. And in the last, most desperate moment, with the barbarians pounding at the gates, a rescuer emerges. Gallantly flanked by a contingent of his elite troops, Stilicho has trekked across mountains and rivers and broken Alaric's siege.
There he is! And that's why, we talk about a lot of these barbarian generals. But, really, some of them are more Roman, or at least do more for the Roman Empire than their damn emperors do. Now, some of them are bad. Like, Ricimer is very commonly demonized. A lot of people don't like Ricimer. If you don't know, he's another one of these powerful generals, but a lot of people feel that in looking out for himself and his own base of power, he did a lot more damage to the empire than he did good. I think Stilicho's a different story. Of course, he's looking out for himself. But if you compare him to his emperor, Honorius, and Honorius will continue to serve after Stilicho is gone, Stilicho is far more suited and qualified to defend the Western Empire than Honorius is. In fact, I think, frankly, at this point, during the beginning of Honorius' reign, Stilicho is sort of holding things up, and when he goes, things will start to crumble. And so basically, the point I'm making is, barbarian background, sure, but this man is just as, if not more Roman than anybody else you can point to during this time period.
The Goths flee, but Stilicho knows Alaric still wants Rome. He tracks the Goths and crushes them in 2 subsequent battles. The weakened Alaric quietly settles somewhere in Illyricum.
Still manages to slip away. I mean, they sort of make a deal, a truce by the end of it, but Alaric manages to slip away from defeat several times. He is a tricky, tricky guy.
It's a few years later that panicked news arrives in Italy. Tens of thousands of barbarian warriors and their families have crossed into the empire. They burn and pillage through Italy with little resistance, led by a new king of the Goths, a man who wants to burn Rome to the ground and slaughter its people. His name is Radagaisus. Stilicho is outnumbered.
A new enemy on the block. That's how it is at this time period. I talked about it before. You just are constantly putting out one fire after the other. Imagine if you're Stilicho, it's like, all right, the new year is hit. What big enemy are we going to be dealing with this time? Is it Alaric? Is it, the Eastern Emperor? Is it a new Gothic leader? Who's up now?
He quickly forms an alliance with the tribal Alans and Huns against Radagaisus. Together, they track down the invaders and eventually surround them. In the heat of battle, Radagaisus runs for his life, but he's captured by the Romans. Stilicho has him executed. So many of the invading barbarians are sold into slavery that the Roman slave market temporarily crashes. This now marks the second time Stilicho has saved the empire from invading barbarians.
Yeah.
But with this shining victory, Stilicho realizes an unsettling truth. His army isn't large enough to defend the Western Empire by itself. However, the aristocrats of the Senate reject Stilicho's pleas for more Roman recruits.
Yeah, here's the thing. I think Stilicho is really doing what he can. He's already saved the empire, saved Italy twice. But he doesn't have the sort of manpower he needs, and every time he has to defend the heartland of the empire from these invasions, well, all he can do is take more troops from the frontier. And he has to, right? He doesn't have much of a choice, but basically what he's doing is taking troops that need to be stationed elsewhere and consolidating them under his rule. A necessary move, but one that sort of necessarily further weakens the borders of the empire. So you can see the sort of predicament that he's in.
As conscription would draw from the population of laborers who currently toil away on their vast estates. The golden age of the Roman Empire has passed. Its senators now place profits
It's long past.
above patriotism. Yet Stilicho sees one solution, Illyricum. It holds thousands of new Roman recruits and its currently disputed territory between the East and West. He plans an invasion to be led by an old enemy, but a capable commander, Alaric.
I do love the interplay between these two, and I'm not necessarily sure of what sort of relationship they had, right? Of course, they were enemies many times, but they've also worked together as well. So I don't know what sort of personal relationship they had, and maybe it was purely politics. Stilicho seemed like a pretty practical guy, and Alaric was definitely an opportunist, so I don't know. I also mentioned that sort of maybe there was some sort of barbarian-style kinship. Once again, this is totally speculative. I'm not entirely sure, but we do know there was some sort of loyalty to Stilicho from other barbarians because of his background. I don't know if it was that way with Alaric, but it is interesting to see this relationship over time.
However, before Stilicho can leave, Honorius furiously calls off the attack. Stilicho has overstepped his bounds and angered the emperor. One court official, Olympius, will take notice and begin to subtly plant doubts about Stilicho in the emperor's ear.
And it's kind of crazy that Honorius would even dare to challenge Stilicho or to doubt his actions. Sure, Stilicho is looking out for himself and building his own reputation, but, Stilicho is holding up this empire. He is defending it from every angle. What are you doing, Honorius? Well, you're leaving it all to Stilicho. This is what I say when I look at these sort of late Roman emperors, especially the weak ones like Honorius who just got pushed around. Sure, I understand that you don't want to be a puppet emperor. I get that. But if the general who's controlling you is doing a good job, then you better have a good replacement if you're going to get rid of that general. Sometimes I think you might be better off just letting that general do their thing, and you can take some of the credit even though you haven't done anything.
Stilicho has little time to mend this relationship. Barbarians cross the Rhine and terrorize Gaul. Around the same time, a man named Constantine III leads a British rebellion and proclaims himself the new emperor of the Western Empire. Mm-hmm. With the backing of Roman Britain,
and Roman Britannia doesn't have much longer to go.
Constantine lands in Gaul, joining forces with many of the invading barbarians. They will conquer most of Gaul and Spain together. In the midst of this civil war, news arrives that the Emperor of the East, Arcadius, has died. His heir is only 7 years old and needs a guardian. Stilicho considers this his last chance to unite the empire and create a combined army capable of driving out Constantine III.
And I mean, you can see all the stuff that Stilicho is dealing with. Barbarian invasions, revolts in the West, and he's still trying to unify the empire. He's still trying to achieve that overarching goal. And when I talk about Roman Britain falling soon, yes, the entire Western Roman Empire will fall soon, but Roman Britain will really be the first to go, and then all those other provinces will follow.
But it's risky traveling to the hostile East, especially if it means leaving the impressionable Honorius alone with Olympius.
Yeah.
Stilicho ultimately decides not to make the journey, but it's too late. Olympius has already poisoned Honorius against him. He has claimed Stilicho is secretly serving barbarians and wants to place his own son, Eucharius, on the Eastern throne.
And so you can see how that sort of xenophobia, or whatever you want to call it, that fear that these barbarians are infiltrating Stilicho. He's not a true Roman. He's not loyal to the empire. He's loyal to the barbarian cause, whatever that may be. You can see how that sort of seeps into the mindset of Honorius, and how it can be used to poison him against Stilicho, even though, as we've seen, and as I firmly believe, Stilicho was doing his absolute best for the Roman Empire. He really was.
At Olympius' prompting, Roman troops begin massacring Stilicho's supporters. Stilicho knows what's coming. He flees to a church with some of his loyal troops, and at daybreak on August 22nd of the year 408, Roman soldiers arrive on orders from Olympius and Honorius. Only after escorting him out of the church do they reveal that they've come to execute Stilicho for crimes against the state. Stilicho's faithful troops intervene in one last, frenzied attempt to rescue their leader, but Stilicho calls them off. He accepts his fate, and he's beheaded. Eucharius, his son, is then arrested and executed. Stilicho's wife, Serena, will later suffer the same fate. Olympius then has Stilicho's followers brutally tortured in an attempt to squeeze out information that might justify the execution. They profess Stilicho's innocence until the very end.
There you go.
Olympius has them killed.
There you go.
Olympius then convinces Honorius to purge allied barbarians from the empire.
And this is one of the reasons why I was pointing out that barbarian connection earlier. And I think I said this is going to be important. I highlighted Stilicho's barbarian background, how he might have related to other barbarians. This is why.
In a manic genocide, the Romans slaughtered tens of thousands of the innocent wives and children of allied Goths serving in the military.
Yeah. And what do you think happened, right? So these barbarians who, look, loyalty is always up to question, but they were serving as federati. And I think under Stilicho, they had someone to be loyal to, whether because he was a good leader or because he had that barbarian background. Now, Honorius has just executed Stilicho, now has gone around massacring the families of these men. Now, do you think they're going to stay loyal to the empire, or has Honorius just created a massive issue for himself that he can't solve because he just killed his best general?
Infuriated Goth soldiers respond by...
And who do they turn to? Who do they turn to?
Defecting en masse to the most powerful barbarian king
there he is!
Alaric.
And you can't really blame him at that point, can you? I mean, their families have just been slaughtered. Stilicho is gone. And so who do they turn to? The most powerful barbarian leader they know, Alaric, who had been defeated several times by Stilicho, but now Stilicho is gone. They turned to Alaric, and now Alaric has a massive force under his control.
With his new massive army, Alaric attempts to take control of the empire. When this fails, he again demands a high office in the Roman army. But Honorius refuses to negotiate, ignorant of the fact that Stilicho's death has left the Western Empire without its watchdog, without its shrewd general to ruthlessly drive out invaders, while simultaneously balancing the interests of capricious barbarian chieftains.
Totally undefended. And I emphasized several times throughout this video that I really think Stilicho was sort of holding everything up. He was doing the best he could to defend the Western Empire, and now that he's gone, a lot of the Western Empire is frankly undefended.
So it happens that in 410, Alaric and his army stampede through Italy and drag the empire to its knees. For the first time in 800 years, the eternal city of Rome falls to a foreign enemy.
And this is a really sort of key event in all of this. Now, Rome itself, the city of Rome, I mean, was not super important at this point as a center of commerce or politics. You know, Mediolanum or Ravenna, they were more important cities politically, but you can imagine that Rome still held a lot of symbolic importance. And so for it to be sacked in the year 410, for the first time in hundreds and hundreds of years, that was very symbolically important and was just another example, frankly, the ultimate example of how far Roman power had fallen.
For 3 days, the Goths defile monuments, torture and kill civilians, and strip the city of its wealth.
And there's I think a pretty strong argument to be made that the deposition and execution of Stilicho sort of led directly to this event. And I think there is also an argument to be made, more broad and less strong, that the execution of Stilicho was pretty damaging long-term to the Roman Empire. And when I say long-term, I'm only talking about the next couple of decades. I'm not saying that the death of Stilicho directly led to the fall of the West. That is a crazy claim to make, but I think if you look at this whole thing, and I do think the Empire was sort of, I don't know if it was inevitable, but it was absolutely on a massive downturn anyway. But the death of Stilicho only accelerated that downturn and accelerated the path towards the West falling. I'll say this, the execution of Stilicho definitely didn't help the Empire survive any longer. That is certainly true.
Rome will recover, but this is the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
From here, barbarian kingdoms will chip away at the empire's borders, and the East and West empires, once together under Theodosius, will never be united again.
Though, I think we can see all of those things were already happening in one way or another. It's not that these problems emerged after the death of Stilicho and the sack of Rome. It's that a lot of these issues that were already present and pretty bad accelerated.
Allies and enemy alike are swallowed in the collapsing Roman Empire. Olympius is arrested and clubbed to death on the orders of one of Stilicho's old followers. And Constantine III, who did rule as co-emperor of the Western Roman Empire for a time, is soon deposed, his severed head sent to Honorius. Finally, King Alaric, a few months after sacking Rome, falls ill and dies.
I mean, I will say, it depends on your perspective. If you're Roman, then this was a horrific event. If you're Alaric or a Goth, then this was a triumphant event. But from that perspective, a pretty triumphant end for Alaric, who had been fighting both for and against the Romans for his entire life. You know, he'd sort of been, pretty badly beaten by Stilicho. They'd sort of ended things in a truce. Alaric had been allowed to settle, but now he goes out like this, sacking the city of Rome. What an accomplishment for someone like him.
These characters, from Theodosius and Eutropius to Alaric and Stilicho, are the actors who introduce Rome's final act. In 476, the western half of the empire falls. The Roman Empire as the world knew it dies, and Europe slowly slips into the Middle Ages. One wonders if Emperor Theodosius might have seen the writing on the wall all those years ago. Civil wars and constant invasions were certainly no sign of a healthy empire. But for a brief moment, for 13 years between 395 and 408, his half-barbarian general Stilicho held it together.
Yeah. And that really is the story. Not that Stilicho made everything fine, or Stilicho managed to perfectly preserve the Western Roman Empire, or that, he even managed to unify the empire. No, it's not that. I think that was basically impossible at this point, but that Stilicho managed to defend the West from the worst of these foreign and internal incursions. He managed to put up a barrier, run around the Western Empire, defending it from all kinds of threats. And when he was gone, everything started falling apart. Are we done? Little cinematic end there. Yeah, we're done. Fantastic video. Hey, go check out History Dose. This video will be linked down below. That was a great one. Like I said, I really wanted to cover this topic. I think it's a real interesting time in Roman history, and I think Stilicho's a real interesting guy. I think he's pretty underrated. I know Ricimer gets a lot of attention for negative reasons. I wanted to shine a bit of a light on Stilicho, a more sort of positive counterpart. And I think a good way to look at this era, the powerful generals, the weak emperors, the division of the empire, the constant barbarian incursions, the sort of weird relationship that Rome had with these barbarian leaders, at times allies, at times enemies, at times being used by them, at times using them. Just some really fascinating stuff. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this one, I would appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you hit the notification button next to the subscribe button, you'll be notified whenever I release a new video. So if you're interested in that, give it a click. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.